Game 5 of the World Chess Championship took place today, the 1st of December, in Dubai. This time, the challenger, Nepomniachtchi, with the white pieces. 4 draws so far, so what would be the battleground, the opening battleground in this 5th game? Well, in fact, it was once again the Spanish, and they repeated all the moves of games 1 and 3 up to a certain point. So it's a mainline Spanish, and Carlsen once again looking to play the Marshall Gambit with d5 if white plays c3. So in game 1 we saw pawn to h3. In game 3 we saw pawn to a4, these so-called anti-Marshall systems, and that's the move that Nepo repeated today in game 5. Now in game 3, Carlsen played bishop b7, which is the main move here. Today he deviated and played rook b8. Now this is a slightly unusual move, but Carlsen had played it in the summer, so not a complete surprise for Nepo. Nepo exchanged, which is very logical. I mean, basically black has abandoned this rook's file, so very logical to exchange pawns to give that rook potential to use the open file. And now h3, crafty little move. Once again, he's kind of inviting black to break in the center with d5. But an h3 is a useful move in that respect. So Nepo is still playing a kind of anti-Marshall system. So in this case, I think white would be absolutely fine because the knight can come to c3 and basically neutralize any pressure that black has. So Carlsen played d6. So standard Spanish move. So strong pawn chain protecting the pawn on e5. c3. So looking perhaps to advance with d4. And Carlsen played b4. So this makes a lot of sense. I think if black doesn't play this move, then that pawn on b5 can ultimately be a bit of a liability. So this exchanges pawns and opens up the b file for the rook. d3, so Nepo playing very modestly, but he was playing pretty quickly. It's quite clear that he'd anticipated this line. And Carlsen exchanged. And now a slight surprise from Carlsen, having played d6 a couple of moves ago, he now broke with d5. Certainly doesn't need to do that. One possibility is perhaps to play here, or bishop e6, and then to play rook a8. But d5 is kind of an attempt by Carlsen to break out and to liberate his pieces straight away. But it's a little bit risky because that e-pawn is potentially vulnerable. Well, we'll see what happens in a second. I mean, first thing is that it would be inadvisable for white to take that pawn in the middle. So what's the difference between this position and the last one where white broke? Well, you can see those pawns are a little bit more vulnerable. The b file is open, and black already threatens to play bishop f6, and that cuts through to that pawn there. I think black would have excellent compensation for the pawn sacrifice. So after d5, what did Nepo do? Well, his reaction, again, he wasn't fazed by this. He reacted very quickly, played knight d2, a very calm move, a good move, because black can't hold the tension for too long here. Carlsen exchanged. But there's no doubt that white is, well, just more comfortable in this position. This is a superb piece. Just pointing down towards that pawn there. And there's no direct attack at the moment, but black always has to be a little bit careful. I mean, it's hard for black to neutralize that bishop. You certainly wouldn't want to do it here because that would damage those pawns terribly. Both pawns are weak. So it's hard for black to completely neutralise the pressure. Also, this square is available for the knight, and it's possible that that knight can hop there at some moment. So it's just a little bit uncomfortable for black. Carlsen played bishop d6, so that at least protects the pawn here, but somehow it feels a little bit passive. You know, that bishop is kind of locked in by its own pawns. And here, very calm move from Nepo, just queen c2. He could have played knight c4, but in fact after this move, and then exchanging bishop for knight, which looks a bit odd actually, but that does give black a lot of security. Rook a8 and something like this. Queen e7. Black is very solid there and prepares to play the bishop out. Exchange off the two bishops. Black should be fine there. So queen c2 was played by Nepo. A very calm move. Just preparing to connect the rooks. The queen obviously protects the bishop already, but protects this pawn as well. h6 from Carlsen. Well, that will prevent a knight coming here. And knight f1, so this knight spins round, and Carlsen now brings this knight, which is doing nothing here, those squares covered by the pawn, and that knight spins round to the king side. So both knights played to the king side. So there's always a bit of potential for those knights to hop in on these outposts. Bishop e3. But Nepo was playing very quickly, playing very nicely. He had a nice time advantage, about a half-hour time advantage here. He'd only used 15 minutes on the clock. Carlsen, yeah, about 3/4 of an hour. And Carlsen did not look particularly happy at this point. And not surprising, this is not an easy position for black. I think white's moves are much easier to play. He found this move after almost 20 minutes thought, queen e8. Well, it's clear that he wants to prepare bishop to e6 to neutralise that bishop here. And here, well, Nepo thought for about 10 minutes and played the rook here, which again, it's kind of very calm. But maybe this was a missed opportunity. He could have played pawn to c4, threatening to advance and push that bishop back and really cramping black. And that's a bit unpleasant. You know, there are kind of artificial moves like queen e6, which stop that pawn advance because that bishop could be taken. But it doesn't look particularly pleasant for black. You know, that queen blocks the bishop, and white can build up pressure with rook a5, double rooks on the a file. Black is under a lot of pressure there. It's uncomfortable. But Nepo was obviously content to just keep the small positional advantage and just try to, you know, squeeze in the long term in this position. And there's no doubt he still holds the advantage here. Bishop a4 attacks the queen. Bishop d7. But you can see this must have been a relief to Carlsen to be able to block this bishop out. Knight d2. So Nepo moves the knight back, looking to come in here at some point, and Carlsen exchanged. So an exchange of queens, but white still holds some advantage here. You can see the knights have potential to hop into these beautiful squares, and that bishop is not a wonderful piece. It's defending, but it certainly isn't active, and that bishop on e3 is a far better piece. So this is all about Carlsen trying to just hold this position, and it's Nepo with a very slight advantage, but a long-term advantage in this position. Carlsen played rook a8. Well, exchanging pieces is wise, but Nepo just protected the rook, and Carlsen activated this rook onto the b file. Rook a6, and here Carlsen decided to defend really passively, which was quite a surprise. He just put that knight back on e8. Nepo brought his king to the middle. That's important. You know, someday that king could even travel across to the queen side. In the endgame, of course, you know, it's good to play actively with the king. Becomes a powerful piece. Knight f8. So Carlsen really just retrenching here. Just retreating. Now, I'll come back to this position later, but Nepo threw the knight forward to f5, which certainly looks like a nice move, but as we'll see, this is a very subtle position. It's a very delicate manoeuvring here, but I'll return to this position. So knight e6, knight c4. So Nepo's moved these knights to nice positions, but Carlsen just holding firm here, defending that bishop. f3, protecting the e-pawn. f6 and g4 from Nepo. So what he's looking to do is he's prevented Carlsen from playing the pawn to h5, but Carlsen didn't mind this. h4, I mean, this looks like quite a nice advance for white to just gain territory on the king side, but this, over the last few moves, Carlsen moving very, very quickly. Now, if h5, you've got to watch out. Suddenly black gets a little bit of counterplay here. The rook comes down. So that's why the king moved out to e2 to cover these entry squares of the rook. And here's an important moment. Carlsen played knight d6. He was playing incredibly quickly here. He was obviously confident that he could hold the fortress here. He's not playing for a win, but he's just looking to neutralize all white's play. So knight d6 played. And now one of these knights has to be exchanged off. Knight c takes d6, bishop takes d6, and Nepo played h5. And optically, this looks very pleasant. That knight is secured on f5. Black will never be able to play g6 to drive it away. That will just be taken and the h-pawn is loose. The bishop still looks very nice. All white's pieces active. But Carlsen just retreated that bishop to f8. And basically the crisis has passed for black. That knight looks impressive, but actually with the bishop on f8, protecting the pawn on g7 and controlling these squares, the knight actually can't do anything from f5. This bishop, also a very nice piece, but notice that knight just covers all these squares, and that knight on e6 is actually doing an excellent job of controlling those squares and protecting the pawn on c7. So actually, it's impossible for white to get anywhere in this position. Well, Nepo tried. Rook a5, king e8 from Carlsen, rook d5. Now, what he's perhaps looking to do is bring the king up the board. Not that that would make a huge difference, but he could perhaps try. Carlsen activated the rook. And now it's difficult because that rook is always going to find counterplay down here and switching the rook across to attack that weakness. So Nepo brought the rook back. But this was really an admission that he has nothing left in the position, and he just used the rook to block out black's rook. And there we go. Carlsen doesn't even need to exchange. He kept his active rook. The players repeated the position for the third time, and that was a draw. Well, this game was all about really fine margins, and I want to take you back to the position here. After move 28, this move knight f8. So Carlsen has retreated. Now here, Nepo played this active move, knight f5. But it would have been better to advance this pawn. Let me make a few moves. Let me make the kind of moves that Carlsen was playing in the game. And now h5, and now knight f5. Now this is different because there's no pawn on g4. And in this position, white still has the option to play g3 and f4. And that's just a little pawn break that puts a bit more pressure on that pawn on e5. Now, I'm certainly not saying that this gives white a winning advantage. I mean, I suspect with best play, black can hold this position, but it's just a little bit more pressure. But certainly in the game, once they got to this point, then white has absolutely nothing with the pawn on g4. It's impossible to use that pawn break, and the position is too dry. Going back earlier, after move 19, this was the moment when, instead of playing slowly, Nepo could have made that move c4, which would have put more pressure on Carlsen. So this is really delicate, and it's all about fine margins. Nepo said afterwards that he said, of course, I'm disappointed. He realised he had the chance to push with some advantage in that game. Carlsen said, the tension is rising and it's getting harder and harder to break through. It's not easy. So there we go. Let's take a look at the scores. 5 draws so far, 2.5 all, and let's have a quick look at the match schedule. Tomorrow, Thursday, is a free day, and they resume a battle on the Friday. So they will limp into the rest day and dress their wounds, and they'll be ready to do battle again on Friday. Do join me then for another recap.